Dylan George, and I will be your affirmative speaker. Thank you all so much for judging today.
And my name is Evan Lopez, and I'll be your negative speaker today. Thank you all very much for being able to judge.
All right, and before we get started with the round, we would love to know more about each of you and about your judging philosophy so we could debate this round according to your preferences to the best of our abilities. So if we want to start with maybe alphabetical by last name and hear from each of you, we'd appreciate that.
Okay, I'll go first. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my name is Shannon Meadow. I'm an experienced judge. Both of my boys competed in NCFCA for many years, and my daughter has been in Stoa for a couple of years. I like to see clash, clear delineation of ideas. I don't like rounds that devolve into a fight over definitions. The best way to deal with definitions is both of you give me your definition and I will sort it out. And also, finally, I like, I call it machine gun talking. I don't like to be, I try to flow. And if you're talking too fast, I can't flow and I miss things. So slowing down for me is a good thing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
I think I'm next. I'm Tali Sneed. I'm very excited to judge today. I'm an alumni. I competed in Stoa for 4 years. All 4 years I did LD and 2 years I did Parley. I'm looking forward to see how you guys debate this resolution. My biggest focus is going to be the value. Don't forget your value. This is values debate. We want to remember that. I'm just super excited to hear what you have to say.
All right, thanks. And I believe last we have Mr. Waddell.
Hey everyone, I'm Sam Waddell. Like Tali, I'm an alumni or alumnus. I competed in policy debate and parliamentary debate. I'm super proud of you guys for making it this far, and I know this round is going to be a blast. I'm excited to judge. I am focused on the value debate. I want to see the clash between your values because most of the time, whoever wins the value debate is probably going to win the round. So don't forget those reasons to prefer, right? Not just why your value is a good thing, but why it ought to be preferred over your opponent's value. That's really important. And I'll be paying attention to applications as well. They're important, even though those don't win the round a lot of times. I like to see how the theories that you're positing in the round actually come into practice. What do they look like in the real world? And the final thing is I would say, focus on your impacts. Tell me why your argument matters. And when I say that, I don't just mean why you win a particular argument, but why winning that argument wins you the round. Those are the most powerful kinds of arguments, and I'll focus on that.
All right.
Sounds good. Thank you all very much for sharing.
Okay, and this will be a 6-minute speech by the affirmative speaker. And I'm going to assume the judges are ready. And Evan?
Yeah, so anytime that you're about to start speaking, I'm just going to keep myself on mute, and you can assume that I'm ready, just so I don't have to go through the process of unmuting and then muting again, just so we can save some time.
Okay, cool. I will do that as well. All right, then. Let's get started. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. You may have heard this phrase before. It appears on much of our currency and national symbols, and was in fact the unofficial motto of the United States up until the 50s. This goes to show how important the idea of assimilation was to our founding fathers. In fact, George Washington, in a letter to John Adams, wrote, and I quote, "By an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, laws, in a word soon become one people," unquote. This is a good explanation of the idea behind E pluribus unum. And because I agree with this idea and the basis upon which our country was founded, and I stand resolved, culture ought to value assimilation over multiculturalism. But first, we need to start off with some definitions. First, culture you can define as a set of ideas, beliefs, and ways of behaving of a particular organization or group of people. That's from Macmillan Dictionary. Assimilation as the process of becoming part of a community or culture. That's also from Macmillan Dictionary. And finally, multiculturalism as the presence of, or support for the presence of, several distinct cultural or ethnic groups within a society. That's from Oxford Dictionary. Now I want to give one point of resolutional analysis for this debate round, which you can tag as culture as actor. Culture as actor. The culture, not the government or any other institution, is specified as the actor in the resolution. So we should only be looking at the effects of culture's valuation of assimilation or multiculturalism. And this would include looking at both the dominant culture and the minority culture as well. Now I want to provide a value that is a weighing mechanism for this debate round, which you can tag as prosperity. Again, prosperity. Now, prosperity basically means the overall well-being of a particular society, which is usually brought about by societal stability, economic growth, individual well-being, etc. This is the ultimate goal of society in general, to prosper. And it's also the goal of immigrants who come to this country hoping for a better life, so it's relevant to this resolution. So given this, we ought to value the ideology that, after weighing the pros and cons, would lead to the most prosperity. Now, let's get to my contentions. That is the reasons I believe assimilation best achieves this value. Contention 1 you can tag as assimilation creates prosperity. Again, assimilation creates prosperity. When we're all united under the same principles and practices with the same goals in mind, we work better together, and this leads to prosperity. It's the age-old principle that two oxen working together can pull more than what each individual one can pull. And we see that this principle has been manifested in my first example, which you can tag as the United States. Now, as I stated briefly in my opening statement, the founders of the country held assimilation in a very high regard. They warned us that unity, not diversity, would be our strength, and that without a shared identity, America would fail. I already mentioned in my opening statement how George Washington certainly thought so. Alexander Hamilton also said that our safety depends on uniformity of principles and habits, and on the exemption of the citizens from foreign bias and prejudice. This was a common view among our founders. Ultimately, they believed assimilation is vital to American strength and prosperity. And so we see the impact here is that because our nation was built on the idea of assimilation around common principles and practices, we have the prosperity we see in America today, the greatest nation in the world. Now, let's move on to my second contention, which you can tag as U.S. immigrants lifted out of poverty. U.S. immigrants lifted out of poverty. This effect is so real that when children are immersed and thus assimilated to a culture via the public school system, the parents are inspired to assimilate as well. According to Keely McGee, 2019, writing for the Washington Examiner, and I quote, "I grew up near Dearborn, Michigan, the Arab American capital of the nation. I know from experience and months of reporting that the children of these migrants are often more successful than their parents because they are forced to learn English and basic civics in the public education system. In many cases, their success inspires their parents to follow suit and take ESL classes so that they too can one day become citizens," unquote. Since it's easier to assimilate children than adults, we see greater prosperity among the children of immigrants than among the immigrants themselves. And this can actually make the immigrants themselves want to assimilate too. So as we see in my first contention, society as a whole has been made strong and prosperous when it values assimilation. Not only so, but under my second contention, we see that when minorities value it, they're made prosperous as well. Assimilation is beneficial to all. Let's move on to my third contention, which you can tag as multiculturalism creates tribalism. Multiculturalism creates tribalism. Built into any truly multicultural society is instability at best and violent tribalism at worst. The fact is different cultures have different values and goals, and this inevitably leads to infighting when both are given a degree of power within a nation. Example, Germany. Again, Germany. Now take a look at this piece of evidence from the BBC, 2018, and I quote, "The report used statistics from Lower Saxony, regarded as an average state, where police saw an increase of 10.4% in reported violent crimes in 2015 and 2016. Later going on to say the report suggested that 92.1% of this increase was attributable to migrants," unquote. So what does this piece of evidence tell us? It tells us that because Germany has valued multiculturalism and hasn't assimilated their immigrants, we see increased terrorism in Germany by these refugees. When assimilation isn't valued, it harms prosperity. Tribalism makes prosperity nearly impossible. And finally, my fourth contention, which you can tag as multiculturalism hurts immigrants. Multiculturalism hurts immigrants. Now, it's important to remember that I'm not advocating that immigrants become perfectly homogenous with the rest of culture, but rather that they prioritize assimilation to our values, languages, and practices. Immigrants' failure to do this results in decreased prosperity. For example, immigrants do much better when learning English. But do you know what greatly discourages immigrants from learning English? Well, living with other immigrants. This is confirmed in a study conducted by two researchers for Purdue University. Now again, I'm not saying we should break up every ethnic enclave and force integration. What I am saying is that when immigrants are encouraged to live this way, when multiculturalism is valued, it hurts immigrants. It's undeniable that immigrants do worse when they remain multicultural, but better when they assimilate. And when we have more immigrants prospering, society as a whole is made more prosperous. So whether you're looking at the dominant or the minority, assimilation is the best thing for you to value if you're looking to live in a prosperous society, and so I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
All right. This is going to be a 3-minute cross-examination. I assume that you're ready, Noah? Or excuse me, Dylan?
Yep.
All right, then let's go ahead and get started. In a culture that values assimilation, can there be a presence of different distinct cultural identities at the same time?
Absolutely.
All right, so even if assimilation is valued by a culture, or it's like for example, the dominant culture, there can still be a bunch of minority cultures that are distinct from the dominant culture, right?
Yeah, assimilation is about valuing a process, not a state of being. So you can't get perfect multiculturalism or perfect assimilation. It's a matter of which one should we promote and value.
Yeah, so if multiculturalism is just the presence of different cultural identities, then how are we supposed to distinct it from assimilation if assimilation also can be the presence of different cultural identities at the same time?
Because there's a difference between the presence of multiple different cultures and valuing the presence of it. So when you're valuing the presence of multiple cultures, you're progressing toward it. You're promoting it. You are actively working toward diversity and division. Whereas promoting assimilation means promoting unity and thus prosperity.
Okay, so then we both agree that multiculturalism is not just the presence of different cultures, but creating an environment in which it is encouraged for different cultures or different values and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, I would say valuing the presence of multiculturalism, valuing the presence of multiple cultures would lead to that. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move down to your resolutional analysis point about culture being the actor. And you said both the dominant culture and the minority culture can value assimilation and multiculturalism, right?
Yeah, we need to be looking at both, is my point.
How can the minority culture value the presence of different distinct cultural identities within a society?
By remaining multicultural and refusing to assimilate would be one way they could value it.
Right, so they can value the presence of different cultural identities and creating an environment where different cultural identities are encouraged by just them, one culture, remaining distinct.
Yeah, by valuing the presence of multiple cultures, they're valuing becoming more distinct from the dominant culture. So again, it's a matter of should they separate or should they come together? That's what the resolution is asking.
Okay. Next, you talked about your value of well-being. You talked about the well-being of a society and also the well-being of an individual, correct?
Yeah, well, what I meant was that the well-being of a society can be determined by the well-being of individuals in it.
So by looking at the overall prosperity, we have to look at the individuals and their individual prosperity, correct?
Sure, I think that's a fair thing to do.
Okay. And so next you talked about the United States. So you talked about the United States back when the founding fathers first created the nation. So are you saying that the United States back then was assimilative or that right now it is assimilative?
I believe our foundations were upon assimilation, and those have continued to this day. Like, we have a lot of foundations as America. We're a pretty young country that have still continued to this day.
All right. No further questions. I'll be taking a little bit of prep time as well. Okay. Stopping prep time. 1 minute used and 2 minutes remaining. This is going to be a 7-minute speech. I'm going to assume that all my judges as well as my opponent are ready. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. While talking about the benefit to an individual when they choose to assimilate is all well and good, when we take a step back and analyze the resolution in its entirety, we must come to one conclusion: that multiculturalism must be valued by the culture in order to create prosperity for the individual. And to understand why this is the case, I'm going to go through, respond to the points that were made in the last speech, as well as bring up a few new points of my own. But before I do that, I want to get into one quick resolutional analysis point, or go into the framework of the round, going to his resolutional analysis point about how culture is the actor. I have one response / clarification point. I don't necessarily disagree with the idea of the culture being the actor, but I want to make one extremely important clarification point, and that is group versus individual. Again, group versus individual. Dylan's own definition of culture was talking about the beliefs and distinctive values or behaviors of a societal group, and he talked about the group specifically. And that's extremely important because it means that we have to talk about decisions that are made by the group as a whole, not just by one individual. And why is that important? It's important because it means that we have to talk about when the resolution says culture is valuing assimilation, it means the overall group is valuing assimilation. And what that would look like in the real world would mean society creating pressure on an individual to assimilate, if we're looking at the dominant culture. And from the minority culture's perspective, it would mean those of the minority culture, those who make up the minority culture, putting pressure on others of that minority culture also to assimilate, because we have to talk about decisions that the whole group will make, and not just the rights of one individual. And I'll be expanding on this point a little bit later. But with that, let's get into the values. Now, I know you guys said that you like a value debate. However, the value of prosperity, there's really not that much to argue with here. And I'm going to agree to this value of prosperity. However, I believe that multiculturalism ultimately creates more value, or at least creates more prosperity for the individual, and also is necessary for a well-functioning society. And actually, that leads me to my first contention, showing why this is the case. My first contention you can write down as multiculturalism creates prosperity. Again, it creates prosperity. And it's very simple. You see, we clarified in cross-examination that multiculturalism was not just a state of being, where you have different cultures that just exist. It is in an environment where there are active choices made by the group, made by the culture to strive towards the support of different distinct cultures. Why is that important? It's important because we're talking about an environment where all people of all cultures with all different values are all included in the group and are all valued equally regardless of what their culture is. And that's extremely important because when you have that sense of inclusion on the part of for the individual, it actually creates more well-being for them as they integrate into the rest of society. And that's actually played out in our own world in Canada. My first application is Canada. Now, before we get into understanding multiculturalism and how it relates to Canada, I want to get into one basic point, and that's subpoint A of basic requirements. Again, basic requirements. Now, the resolution. Now, as Dylan talked about in cross-examination, you can't have 100% multiculturalism nor 100% assimilation. So instead, we talk about what is valued more. So in a society that values multiculturalism more, there are still basic standards of assimilation that can be had for citizenship. For example, in Canada, you have to be able to provide language results in order to join the country as a full citizen. According to a Canadian immigration law firm in 2017, quote, for Canadian immigration, you have to provide language test results from an authorized organization, end quote. So whenever Dylan talks about multiculturalism, meaning that you aren't learning the language, that simply isn't the case. Subpoint B is successful integration. Again, successful integration. Like we talked about before, Canada, or in general, multiculturalism means a welcoming environment for all individuals. Canada specifically passed a Multiculturalism Act in 1988 to protect multiculturalism as one of the foundations of its country. And as a result, it's become one of the things that Canadians are most proud of. One source once did a poll talking about including several thousand Canadians, and it was found that of the top 10 things that they were most proud of, multiculturalism was number 3. And it's actually extremely important to understand how this has affected the individuals as a whole. According to Eileen Blomrad, an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, writing for the Globe and Mail, which is a Canadian newspaper, in 2017, quote, my research points to multiculturalism as a key factor driving Canada's success at citizenship integration. It legitimates diversity, provides a sense of inclusion, and through the multitude of government grants given to community-based organizations, it provides the support structures to help newcomers join the country as full citizens, end quote. So in other words, the culture valuing multiculturalism has created a system where each individual has many legal benefits on a legal and technical scale. Now, Dylan talked about the idea of how we're talking about culture valuing it and how we can't talk about the government. But here's my issue with this point. You see, the government valuing multiculturalism is a direct result of its culture valuing multiculturalism. Thus, the benefits can still be attributed to the culture itself valuing it. And here's another extremely important point that I want to make clear. Canada does not mean Canada still has does have a specific distinctive, nationality with certain specific traits and groups. In fact, as Machaza Hussein, an author that focuses on Middle Eastern and European topics, explained in Al Jazeera in 2013, quote, Canadians are bound together by a set of values and beliefs which are able to accommodate a broad range of cultural expressions. All that is asked of immigrants is what is asked of any members of society, respect for laws and social amiability, end quote. You see, even though it values multiculturalism, there is still a place for everyone to come together under certain values. So when we talk about culture, if Dylan tries to talk about the idea of how Canada is actually trying to assimilate its citizens, don't take that to be the case, because assimilation does not mean that you're all going to go under the same values. There are specific cultural values that you can assimilate to, but in general national values, it's a completely different case. Let's get into some responses to his case. My response to his first contention of the United States is protection of multiculturalism. Again, protection of multiculturalism. While the United States certainly does have some specific national different issues, or not issues, national places for assimilation, we also protect multiculturalism and protect every single individual's rights to express their own culture and their own religion. For example, in the Bill of Rights. In response to multiculturalism leads to tribalism, my response is state versus culture. Again, state versus culture. Here's the issue. We're not just talking about the government trying to force all of the people into their own separate groups. When the culture values it, when we try to protect every individual, the result is where citizens are protected by their well-being. Thank you.
All right. 3-minute cross-sects when you're ready, Evan.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's get started. Agree that what is good for an individual would largely be good for a group of individuals, right?
Wait, sorry, you cut out at the very beginning of that sentence. Can you please repeat that?
Okay, let me start from the beginning. You would agree that groups are made up of individuals, right?
Yes.
Okay, so could we then conclude that what is generally good for an individual would be generally good for a group of individuals?
Not necessarily.
Okay, let's move on to your application of Canada. You talked a lot about this. So you would agree that this was a government policy requiring immigrants to meet basic requirements before coming into the country, right?
Yes, there is place for assimilation in this case.
Right, and you talked also about the Canadian Multicultural Act. So what specifically did that do?
The Canadian Multicultural Act specifically protected every single individual's right to enjoy their own culture and put protections in place for every individual to respect each other person's culture.
Okay, so basically it just said you can do whatever you want.
Not necessarily you can do whatever you want in terms of, you can perform or do whatever you want in terms of actions. Of course, there are basic laws. However,
that's what I meant.
On a cultural level, it protects your right to be able to do whatever, perform whatever kind of culture you want and not have to experience any kind of adversity for it.
Okay, let's move on to your response to my application of the United States. You said that we protect multiculturalism. How does the United States specifically promote multiculturalism?
The United States promotes multiculturalism, though there are certain national values, just like in Canada, every single individual has a right to kind of act out their own culture and their own beliefs and their own religions, and while also at the same time protecting their right to associate themselves with whomever they want.
Yeah, so we protect it, but how do we promote it?
It's promoted because we actually teach in our schools as well as in general in our education system, talking about different beliefs and different values and how to be respectful of each other.
Okay, let's move on to your state versus culture argument. Now, let me get this straight. Your main argument here was that the problem was that it was the government being involved with enforcing multiculturalism, right?
Yes.
Okay, wasn't that what you just claimed Canada was doing?
No, Canada was talking. The difference between Canada and Germany was that Canada, the government followed the steps of the culture. It was not the other way around, where the government was trying to make decisions to change its own culture.
Okay, so how is one influenced by the culture and the other isn't? What's the basis of that claim?
Well, so in Canada, its culture is very multicultural, and as a result, the government created specific protections for it. Whereas in Germany, there wasn't actually any specific cultural attempt to create that multiculturalism, because it was the government trying to benefit from it.
Okay, thanks. No further questions, and I'm going to be starting 3 minutes of prep. All right, I've stopped my prep time. I have 2 minutes and 20 seconds left. And I'm going to assume that everybody's ready and go ahead and get started. William McKinley said, "The mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation. This is our mission as a country, and is why America has been able to become so prosperous." And I'm going to be talking more about that in my responses, but before we get into that, first we need to deal with the resolutional analysis. The response here was group versus individual. You can tag my response as interlinked. Again, interlinked. Now, groups are made up of individuals, and I believe that we can conclude that generally what's good for an individual is good for a group. So in other words, if we see that when an immigrant assimilates, they are made more prosperous, we can thus conclude that if a group of immigrants assimilate, they will be made more prosperous. This is kind of a very small distinction that I don't think is very relevant to this round. So I would just say that they're very interlinked and that we can look at both to determine the outcome of the other. Now, let's move on to the application of Canada. There are 2 subpoints under this about basic requirements and successful integration. And I'm going to have 2 responses to this application. The first one you can tag as assimilation comes first. Again, assimilation comes first. Now, Evan himself said that Canada has basic requirements to immigrate to their country, like you have to learn the Canadian language. This is exactly what valuing assimilation means. It doesn't mean not allowing any diversity at all. That would be ridiculous. All it means is that assimilation is prioritized over multiculturalism. All it means is that assimilation has to be valued first and multiculturalism has to come second. This is exactly what Canada is doing. They're valuing assimilation over multiculturalism. So we see that the impact here is that Canada actually values assimilation first, even though they value multiculturalism too. Assimilation is their first priority, and so it's actually an application that goes to support the affirmative side. My second response you can tag as valued by minority. Again, valued by minority. Now, Evan talked about how there's successful integration of the minority into Canada. So we can thus conclude that the minority is valuing assimilation to Canadian culture as well. And we see that the result of that has been one dominant Canadian culture. We see there's a lot of aspects of Canadian culture like dialect, like cuisine, like general cultural customs that are all unique to Canada. Canada didn't originally used to be like this. When the British and French originally colonized Canada, there was a lot of division. There was a lot of conflict there, but they've now coexisted for so long that they've kind of become one assimilated homogeneous whole, and that is why we see prosperity in Canada, because they've become one Canadian culture. It didn't always used to be that way. Now, let's move on to some responses to my case. First, the response was given about how the United States protects multiculturalism. You can tag my response as promotion of assimilation. Again, promotion of assimilation. Now, this is really key to this round, is that it's not about protecting one, and it's not about which do we have. It's about which do we promote. And the United States doesn't promote diversity. We don't encourage immigrants to remain more separate from the dominant culture. We don't encourage immigrants to become more divided from the rest of culture. We encourage them to become more like the rest of culture. That's what we see in the United States today, is we promote assimilation over multiculturalism. We allow for multiculturalism, but ultimately we promote assimilation. We value it higher. In response to state versus culture, I'm going to have 2 responses. First, you can tag as assimilation not valued. Again, assimilation not valued. My evidence stated that there was a vast increase in crime because of the immigration into Germany. And the reason why is that assimilation wasn't being valued. If assimilation was valued by the minority and dominant culture, we wouldn't have seen such an increase in crime. We wouldn't have had a problem here. If assimilation was valued, then the problems would have been solved and prosperity would have been achieved better. My second response you can tag as as double standard. Again, double standard. Now, Evan's claim here is that because we're looking at a state government policy, we can't look at it as an example of multiculturalism. But he just invoked the Canadian Multiculturalism Act as an example of multiculturalism. So we see a bit of a double standard here, and I think that we ought to look at both in the round because both are examples of multiculturalism. Thanks.
I'm going to take a little bit more prep time as well. No further prep time needed. I'm going to assume that my opponent and all my judges are ready. With that, we can go ahead and get started. Because all of the benefits of assimilation can be had while multiculturalism is still valued more, I support a negative ballot. I want to go through and boil down some of the most basic argument, or boil down the most important arguments to a couple of basic points. But before I do that, I want to go through and respond to all the points that are made in the last speech before presenting some voting issues. Starting off with the idea of interlinked. And I essentially said that there's no real difference between the group valuing it versus the individual because we talk about what benefits them more at the same time. I have one response, and that is pressure on individual. Again, pressure on individual. Now, the importance of the important distinction between the group valuing it and the individual valuing it is it's because when the group values it, it means even if one individual doesn't want to, there is pressure on that individual to go with the group. Because otherwise, if the group is split off, then it's actually just a bunch of individuals in the first place. So when we look at the group valuing multiculturalism or the group valuing assimilation, what it looks like is the group or the environment that is created is one where you assimilate or, well, you're not treated the same. You're not treated equally. And that is not prosperity. In a culture that values assimilation more than multiculturalism, and the sake of uniformity and everyone holding the same values and doing the same things, will not succeed. And to understand why this is the case, let's move down next to my application of Canada. Now, he said that assimilation is valued first, and therefore it's valued over multiculturalism. I have one response, and that is multiculturalism valued more. Again, multiculturalism valued more. Now, what he essentially said was, well, there is assimilation because there are basic language requirements, and you get to learn about Canadian values. But here's the issue. There are basic standards for assimilation. It does not mean that because assimilation exists, it's somehow valued more than multiculturalism. I agree. There are basic standards of assimilation that are necessary for society to function. But it does not mean that assimilation suddenly has to be promoted more than multiculturalism, or people are encouraged more to change their values than stay distinct. Yes, I agree. People should change some basic behaviors or learn some kind of basic language. But it does not mean that multiculturalism can't be valued more than assimilation. That's the key word here. It's over. Multiculturalism over assimilation. Valuing multiculturalism over assimilation, like in Canada, where they have specific protections for it, you can gain all of the benefits. All of the benefits of people being able to understand and communicate with one another while still retaining different values and retaining different distinct cultures. Next, move on to his second response. He talked about how it's valued by the minority. And essentially he said that, well, they adopted Canadian values because they do have a specific Canadian culture. I have two responses. My first response is not in conflict. Again, not in conflict. Yes, a Canadian or minority cultures can adopt some basic Canadian traits. Like, for example, hockey is a very big Canadian thing. So if someone goes to Canada and they start to enjoy hockey, it doesn't mean that they've assimilated and suddenly they've become more like the rest of everybody else and lost their culture. It doesn't work that way. Assimilating to a new thing, assimilating to a new culture, being in conflict with multiculturalism means that you have to become less like your old self and more like your new self. Adding something onto your past culture and still having a distinct culture and all their distinct values does not mean you're actually in conflict with each other. My second response is distinct cultures. Again, distinct cultures. Now this goes back to the idea of how multiculturalism is still valued over assimilation in Canada. There are very distinct cultures, and yes, while people get to learn how to get along with each other, they do so in spite of their differences. That's what it looks like whenever a culture values multiculturalism or it creates an environment where multiculturalism is encouraged. In fact, according to Canada's government itself, the Citizenship and Immigration Canada, which is created to link immigration services with citizenship registration, they said, quote, Canadian multiculturalism is fundamental to our belief that all citizens are equal. Multiculturalism ensures that all citizens can keep their identities, can take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging. Acceptance gives Canadians a feeling of security and self-confidence, making them more open to and accepting of diverse cultures, end quote. You can get along with each other even if you don't assimilate to the same basic values. It simply doesn't work that way. And if Dylan tries to tell you otherwise, I'll point you back to this example of Canada, where the exact opposite is the case. Let's move down to the United States. And he essentially said, we promote them to become similar to us. I have two responses. My first response is multiculturalism promoted more. Again, multiculturalism promoted more. Once again, I agree. Immigrants are encouraged to take on some basic United States traits, like, for example, speaking English. That's not an example of suddenly assimilation being valued more than multiculturalism. In our own education systems, multiculturalism and the idea of accepting people of differing values, differing heritages, is put as one of the most forefront aspects of our society. My second response is actually my first voting issue, and that is individual's choice. Again, individual's choice. When a culture values multiculturalism, it doesn't keep an individual from being able to decide if they want to assimilate or not. An individual can choose to adopt whatever values they want. It is not culture's choice or the group's choice to make that decision for them. That is extremely important, because if the individual believes that they want to assimilate, they can. It's not the group's choice. Let's move down to Germany. He said that assimilation is not valued. My response is not culture's choice. Again, not culture's choice. I was talking about the culture not being the one that was valuing assimilation, but instead the government trying to make culture change. He said it's a double standard. My response is culture first, government after. Again, culture first, government after. It was the culture that valued it, and then the government followed suit. Because of that, I negate the resolution.
All right, I'm going to be using my last 2 minutes and 20 seconds of prep time. And I'll turn off my mic so you don't have to hear the ugly sound of my timer. All right, I'm going to start my prep time. This will be a 3-minute rebuttal by the affirmative. I'm going to assume everybody is ready and get started. I'm going to jump right into the argument and then move on to some 3 quick voting issues on the fundamentals of this round and why an affirmative ballot is warranted at the end of the day. So let's get started. In response to pressure on the individual, you can tag my response as the individuals are valuing. Again, the individuals are valuing. A group is only as good as the individuals are in it. A group is only what the individuals decide for that group to be. And so if a group values something, the individuals in that group are valuing that thing. They're kind of one and the same. A group is made up of individuals. In response to multiculturalism valued more, in response to Canada, you can tag my response as values and language come first. Again, values and language come first. Remember, what is a culture? It's a set of ideas, beliefs, and ways of behaving. And Canada prioritizes your assimilation to these before diversity, and that's why they're able to succeed. They value assimilation more. In response to not in conflict and distinct culture, you can tag my response as, again, valued over. The immigrants coming to Canada are valuing assimilation to Canadian values and Canadian language before retaining their own culture. That's exactly what valuing assimilation over multiculturalism means and entails. Now let's move back through my case. In response to multiculturalism promoted more, you can tag my response as assimilation more. Again, assimilation more. The United States values assimilation more than multiculturalism because we're just like Canada in that we prioritize your assimilation to our values and to our language over maintaining your own culture. That's what it means to value assimilation more. In response to individuals' choice, you can tag my response as what should they choose? Again, what should they choose? The question of the resolution is asking us what would be the good choice for that individual to make. Should individuals or groups of individuals value assimilation, or should they value multiculturalism? What would be the best choice to reach the value of prosperity? Now, in response to Germany, the response were given of not culture's choice and culture first. You can tag my response as culture was choosing. Again, culture was choosing. The dominant culture was choosing to let these people remain multicultural and not assimilate them. And the minority culture was choosing to retain their own culture and not assimilate to German values and language. And as a result, we saw great conflict break out in Germany and even throughout all of Europe as a result of that. Now, let's move on to 3 quick voting issues. The first one you can tag as protection is not promotion. Again, protection is not promotion. And this is a fundamental flaw of the negatives case, is that protecting multiculturalism is not promoting multiculturalism, is not valuing multiculturalism. We can protect multiculturalism while valuing assimilation. My second voting issue you can tag as dropped arguments. Again, dropped arguments. My second and fourth contentions for my first speech were completely dropped by the negative, and so these flow to the affirmative. And we see the impact here is concrete benefits. Again, concrete benefits. I've successfully proven with these contentions that assimilation has concrete benefits when the minority takes them on. And my third voting issue you can tag as no proven harm. Again, no proven harm. The negative never had a contention on how assimilation harms prosperity. And therefore, we conclude that because I've proven assimilation helps prosperity, and Evan has never proven that it harms prosperity, an affirmative ballot is absolutely warranted at the end of the day. Thank you.
Good job, Dylan.
Good job, Evan. That was a great finals. And thank you all so much for judging.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Well done, guys.
Good job.